Thank you so much for agreeing to this interview. I really hope for this to be to focus more on the emotional aspects and also to communicate to people what this is like, especially because like the age gap was so different for Vietnam compared to other wars. Um, and I'm also personally am curious about the experiences because as someone who's growing up and coming of age and has grandparents who lived at that time as well, I'm really interested in I can start as a 15-year-old, I can start imagining myself in the shoes of people during your generation and what that must have been like. And so that
Yeah.
really sparked an interest in me. So my first question is about how you joined the military, and you were drafted. So could you speak to that, what that was like, emotionally?
Well, when I was in high school, and it towards the last year or two I was in high school, it became more aware, became much more aware that the draft existed. And when you were 18, you could get drafted, and so only the boys. So the guys started. It started becoming kind of an undercurrent of talk as to whether or not people were going to get drafted or join. The only difference much is that if you would join, you had more of a handle on what you might be able to do while you were in the military. Whereas if you're drafted, you don't really have much choice about what they're gonna do with you. And looking back on it, really, it's sort of a matter of what the tests that they give you when you are in the induction center. You answer all these questions about yourself, give a psychological profile, it helps them to figure out what to do with you. So, but as that time gets closer and closer, the anxiety goes up. And so it may not be a severe anxiety, but it's an anxiety anyhow. So as it gets closer, I remember looking into it and saying, well, what's the consequences if I don't join? If I don't go along with it, if I don't show up or go to Canada or something like that. And it says you must join or you will be prosecuted and with up to 5 years in prison and a $250,000 fine. So that kind of hangs over your head. And currently boys aren't getting drafted, or young men aren't getting drafted, but they still have to register for the selective service. If you don't, they threaten you with the same thing, 5 years or $250,000. And a lot more people aren't going into that. So that a bunch of the states have made it so that as soon as you're 18, you're automatically signed up. You don't sign anything. You don't send in anything. They just automatically sign you up. So there's less choice about it now than there was back then. So at the time, then you go for a physical. And I lived in on the edge of San Francisco. I don't know if you're familiar with that area at all, but I had to go across the bay to Oakland to the induction center to get a physical.
Mhm.
And so you go through all that, walking through the halls from one station to the next station to the next station in your boxer shorts, and then shortly thereafter, they send you a letter saying report on this date, which in my case was the 25th of January. 1967. And they had a choice about what military to put you into, but most people were put into the army like I was. There have been cases where they put somebody in the Navy, I think. But I didn't have much of a conscience back then about what was right or wrong about that whole thing in Vietnam, because unless you're paying close attention to the news, which isn't at all like it is today, you have to get newspapers or you watch television. There wasn't any phones or computers or any of that kind of stuff. So news was a little sketchy unless you paid attention to those mediums. So you might not know things very well. Like I didn't know much about the civil rights movement throughout high school, just because it didn't cross my mind, my front of me a little bit, but not a lot. So,
How old were you when you were drafted?
21.
And how did you like how did your family react, your community when you were drafted?
Well, they accepted it as being just what you had to do. My dad had been in the army during World War II. Most of his brothers and my mother's brothers also, they came from very big families of 14 and 10 people in each family, 14 in my mom's, 10 in my dad's. So there was more boys than girls, and most of them went into the military back then. Um, my dad's twin brother was killed in Europe in January or February of 1945. Uh, he's my namesake. His name was Tom, and they were pretty close. My mother's family didn't lose anybody, but one of her brothers was captured by the Germans in Europe and kept in prison for a year before he was liberated.
Did those experiences weigh on you when you were drafted?
In a way, I but nowadays when I think about it, I think like I was groomed to join the military by what I was allowed to consume. When you're a little kid, when back in there, when those days when you're a kid, you might like coloring books or comic books, and you might start off looking at uh, Walt Disney comic books with Donald Duck and Mickey Mouse and all them characters. You know those characters,
Yeah.
and but then comic books and what movies I get to watch. I got to watch, and my dad took me to a movie when I was probably 5 years old. It was a war movie at a theater where I was, and it was scary because the airplanes shooting each other down and stuff. So all those little things like that. And then when I went from Mickey Mouse and that kind of stuff to comic books that were war stories. There was quite a few comics that were designed just to be fictional war stories about World War II. And most of the movies that were put out back in those days were more or less fictional stories about World War II. And they were largely propaganda to make us be the good guys and the other side be the bad guys. And sometimes the bad guys would win, which would make you feel incensed about, oh no. But I got into the habit of liking to watch war movies. And I probably have seen nearly every war movie ever made at least once several times, especially when I was younger. And so I was into war comic books. And then my mom was a real big um, advocate of the library. So she took me to the library, me and my brother, when we were little boys. We got to liking to go to the library. So when I was a teen, I started looking into what was in history. I kind of liked history. So I went to the part of the library that had the history books about war, and I would check those books out. And then sometimes I would buy books, comic, uh, pocket books, paperbacks that were stories about fighter pilots or some different aspect of the military. And usually they were true stories, so they say. And and I would draw. I would draw pictures of military airplanes. And I would I had a book that I got from the library that had lots of pictures of all the World War II airplanes, and I would try to draw them. And I also made little plastic model airplanes. You buy these little boxes, and they have all the parts for a little plastic model of an airplane. They were all World War II airplanes. And sometimes I would take a hot needle and poke holes in it like had gotten shot. So I was groomed by what I was allowed to do. And like for my 16th birthday, the thing I wanted most was a large coffee table book called The Pictorial History of World War II. Even on television, they used to have this program that was on almost every day. I think it was called Adventure Time. And it had a bunch of different, what were called serials. That was a story that you get a piece of a movie, and then we continue the next day and the next day and the next day and the next day. And they would make it exciting, making it look like things got really weird at the end of the story, and then you get to the next day, and they got out of that one, and it goes on. So there was stories about, I think what I want to call it, Captain Winslow of the Coast Guard. And so I was allowed to watch that stuff. So then when came time to getting drafted, I had started going to community college. And when you were being ready to be drafted, if you could get out of it with what was called a college deferment, but that was only you could only get a deferments for 4 semesters, like 2 years, and they wouldn't take you until your 4 semesters was up. So I got those deferments and I kept going to school. But I didn't like college very much at all. I wasn't a really great student. I could get passing grades mostly time, but it was just sort of like high school, more high school. But then towards the end of my college thing, I started getting interested in aviation, and the college had a bunch of courses in aviation. So I went from studying architecture to aviation. Um, so, and when it got time that my deferments were up, I went and applied to see if I could go to an actual flight school where you would actually be in airplanes learning to fly. And they said that they would take me as a student and they could get me a fifth deferment. So I could go to the school and get my commercial pilot's license and my flight instructor certificate and an instrument rating, and before I would have to face the draft again. So I did that also. I got those licenses and actually started work at the airport where I first went started getting a little bit of training to be as a flight instructor. Well, by that time, I wanted to see if it was possible to be a pilot in the military. Well, when I was 17, I was in an automobile accident where I was in a head-on collision and my face hit the windshield and I had scars on my face and stuff. And I started wearing glasses when I was 17 because it kind of did a little number on my eyeball. Went to the Air Force and went to the Navy and went to the Army and to see if I could get into the flight programs. But because my vision wasn't perfect 20/20 at my age, they wouldn't take me. So I couldn't become a military pilot. So I just decided, well, 2 years isn't that long. I'll just suffer through it. So by that time, um, I went and see, was I actually, I was 21. I would have been 22 in October of 1967.
Do you think that your experience before you were drafted, where you were, as you say, groomed to be a soldier, do you think that how did that affect your kind of mindset going into the war? Did it allow you to romanticize it, or did you still like how did you view it, and how did that those experiences before you went drafted and like your experience with war beforehand affect your experience when you were actually a soldier?
Well, it was confusing. It was confusing. And, confusion basically means lack of truth. When there's not, truth isn't present, then confusion sets in. So I would read these stories about how guys were doing all these different things. Like I was really interested in fighter pilots, but I also read about infantry experiences and how horrendous those events were of having to attack the enemy and kill them on sight. You know, in the war in the Pacific, if you're not familiar, there was a war in Europe and there was a war in the Pacific.
Right.
Um, there was what they called island hopping. And then the Japanese controlled a big chunk of the land masses in the Pacific Ocean, and the American soldiers' job was to invade every island one at a time and get rid of the enemy, kill them all off, take them prisoner, take it over. And those were horrendous. We can't even possibly know how awful that might have been. But from what little I've read and understood, and from studying it, which I've done quite a bit of, it was difficult. It's very difficult. And you don't often find soldiers from that era that will even talk about it. Of course, most all of them are dead now, but back when I was younger, they weren't. And you just didn't, they wouldn't talk about it because it was so horrible. Part of the reason I'm able to talk about these things was that I didn't have experience any of that high level gross horror. I was close to it. I was on the edge of it, and I was in the vicinity of where that could have happened. So I was experiencing the emotion of walking around in the forest and or what they called the jungles, the beautiful forests of Vietnam, anticipating that something could happen. So that's a high level of anxiety that causes PTSD. And so, but back earlier, um, some of what I would read would make me feel like this is terrible. Why is this even allowed to happen? Like I found a book one time in the library called This Must Not Happen Again. And it was a little book, probably smaller than this. You can see this how big it is to my head. Maybe maybe that size. And it was a story of the Holocaust that happened in Europe with the Jews and the Gypsies and everybody else that the Nazis wanted to get rid of. And the Nazis um, filmed a lot of the things that they did. They would film mass murders and they would film the different ways that they had of mass killing people. And this little book was full of those kinds of pictures and some written stuff. And when you're young and you read that kind of stuff, it's like shocking to know that some people will actually do that.
With since you said you weren't very involved with the news at the time,
Mm-hmm.
how did your perception of the war in Vietnam affect, well, how did it change, and also how did it affect your perception of America?
Well, once we landed, got out of the airplane, and I don't remember where it was, some big airport in Vietnam. And I walked out of the airplane. I had all of a sudden I had a feeling like this is wrong. This is not right. I didn't have any big evidence and nothing that I could see that would tell me that, but it just somehow didn't set well with me. But I kept going through the processes and everything and getting involved with the people that I was involved with. And so it kept, it could tell from the way people acted that nobody was gung ho to do this job and get it done. So everybody was trying to just get their time over because you're only expected to stay there for a year and then you could go home. So unless you really like being there, you might you might decide to stay another year or two, re-enlisting. Most people just wanted to go home. So you just there it became one of the things that guys would talk about was how short they are. Short meaning how long before you get out. And sometimes when we were walking around out in the forest, we would go hide out instead of doing what they told us to do, just because it didn't seem right. There was a lot of alcohol available to people, a lot of cannabis, and it seems like everybody was into one or the other. So it looked, the longer I was there, it looked kind of like there was no hope. There was no, our country was into this terrible war, and what was I going to go back to? Well, the thing that started appealing to me, where there started to become some glimmers of hope, was in the news that I got about the hippies that existed around San Francisco, which is where I was from. And so I would get news about them. Even the military newspaper, the Stars and Stripes, would write a story up sometimes about the hippies. And so the group of guys that I hung around with, we all started kind of becoming underground hippies, where we would have some of the we'd grow our hair as long as we could, which wasn't very long, or we'd grow a mustache. We'd wear beads around our necks sometimes, unless they got told to take them off. And so we would do the best to distract ourselves from the reality at hand by listening to music. Armed Forces radio, which you could get on a radio, was would play a lot of the popular music from the 60s. So we'd sit around and on bunkers and listen to the music sometimes. One of the things that happened with me about then was I learned to like black people. I didn't have any black friends when I grew up in high school. I mean, they were on the track team with me and stuff, but we weren't really friends except to say hello. Well, in Vietnam, I got to be friends with several of them, and that has stuck with me my whole life. So there was the difficulty of thinking you're going to have to go out and walk around in the boonies with it, or you could go find some time to hang out with your friends if you're in a particular kind of a base where you're not having to be walking around in the jungles. So it became a waiting game. Wait until you get done and get out. Some guys wouldn't do that. They would not participate. They would not do what they're told, and they were put in prison. There was an infamous prison called Long Ben Jail. Long Ben is a Vietnamese word, Longbien, which is the name of a place, and that's where the jail was located. And if you wouldn't participate, you were going to get court-martialed and you've been put in jail for a while. I didn't get put in jail, but I knew people that were. And I knew some people that got killed too. And so when I got back, the first place I wanted to go to was where the hippies hung out, which was called the Haight-Ashbury district of San Francisco. There's streets, Haight Street and Ashbury Street, and they intersect, and it's kind of one of the centers, or there could be a lot of activity. It was a little busy little street on the edge of Golden Gate Park where a lot of people hung out. So it's been a healing process for me to come through, to be coerced into the military and to be groomed into the military with a lot of stuff that was not true, not true at all. It was very disappointing in a lot of ways to find out that our country would lie to us so blatantly and send us to where we could be killed. Um, they like to say that it was a war against the expansion of communism. But I learned recently from a friend who just did an extensive study of many years about how that war came about. And when the United States first started getting involved with Vietnam, the common history is that we got involved in around 1954, when the French were defeated and thrown out of Vietnam. They were the colonizers that colonized Vietnam, and they were brutal colonizers. They were brutal because there got to be massive starvation because the French would buy up all their rice and sell it somewhere else, and a lot of other things. Well, an army grew in the northern area of Vietnam and threw the French out, and so the U.S. decided to take over the fight. But it had already been deeply involved in Vietnam as early as 1865. The U.S. started having business relationships. So it's been a big learning process for me to understand the truth of war, because I really like to understand why are things like this? What's going on? What made it be like this? Even not even war, but just day to day. Why is it like this? But war in particular. And I've read quite a lot of books and eventually joined an organization called Veterans for Peace and have participated in some of their events. So I learned basically that war is based on lies, all of them, that there has never, ever been a good war. I even asked my mom shortly before she died in early 2000, 2003 or somewhere. I said, Mom, was World War II a good war? She said, without hesitating, it was a lousy war. And so she had experienced a lot of the family issues firsthand. Her brother and brothers and her husband, my dad, and their lives about it, what happened too. It's just it's a few things I could tell you, but I want to know answer what you want me to answer for too.
I was just gonna ask, especially being so young, being in your 20s,
Hmm.
how did how did that factor into it? Like, how did do you think that made it harder for you to like cope with what was happening and understand it and process it?
Um, Maybe yes, but it was took till later that I understood why they take young people, why the military always wants young people. There's JROTC units in a lot of high schools. Why is this so important? Well, what are the attributes of a young person? Their minds are quick, their bodies are strong, their bodies are extremely fast. They can think on their feet often, and they can learn things really quickly, and that makes them perfect for to be a soldier. They can take advantage of all those attributes and make you do what they want you to do. Either convince you that what they want you to do is the actually right thing to do, or you just do it because there are other reasons. So, I didn't have a strong conscience back in those days. I was a little more of a selfish person, and it took some years for me to develop my conscience to understand how I was being exploited. And it made me angry to understand that. And it's only been in the last few years that I've come to grips with that anger. Now I'm 80 years old, and um, a year or so ago, I had a minor stroke, which hardly was a stroke at all. It just kind of paralyzed me for about 20 or 30 minutes, and then I came out of it. But I went to the hospital for a night. And they checked me out, and they said, "Well, it's sort of a stroke, but not really a stroke, but sort of a stroke." But it unlocked um, the fear that I had been carrying around in me, and I had to come to grips with that. By the way, if you can see that very well,
Hmm.
that's who I was. That's who I was back then. So where were we?
You were talking about how you only recently like came to terms with
Oh yes,
experiences.
that's been wonderful because if you walk around, if you have anger in your soul, you you're always having to deal with it one way or another, and it keeps you from being very happy, having much joy in your soul. So after that mini stroke happened, I had a lot of anxiety and I wasn't sleeping hardly. Went on for a few weeks, and a friend of mine goes to a particular counselor that she likes, and I told her about it, and she said talk to Kenneth. So I talked to Kenneth, and I had about 6 sessions with him, and I got some medication to help me sleep from another doc. And I kept studying about how to deal with this anxiety and stuff because it's PTSD related. And I've had a change in my heart and my soul to where I'm a much happier person. And I'm able to talk about this without a lot of emotion. And so it was enough of a change that people noticed.
Right.
You're different. What's happened with you? So I'm grateful for that, that it's noticeable.
How how did it affect like the rest of when you got back? How did your experiences affect your life? Did you talk to anyone about it? People talk to you about it, or was it more something that was held in silence?
Oh, a lot of silence with my friends because I would hang out with my old friends that I had before I went in the military. And stayed with my parents for a couple weeks. And then I went and lived with some guys that had an apartment in the basement of a building. And one of them was a Vietnam veteran also that I went to high school with. But they were just more into partying. And that's what was primarily on their mind, not talking about what had happened much. So, but it caused me to have some difficult times processing what I was feeling. Um, so I lived with them for a while, and then Then I found one of my other older friends that I hadn't known her very much, and she was going to a class that was held by a guy who had been a Korean War veteran, but he had become a college professor, and and saw that a lot of his brighter students were leaving college and going and living in the Haight-Ashbury and experimenting with psychedelic drugs. And so I started going to his class and I started learning a lot of stuff. And I realized that there was some hope, but it wasn't in politics. It was in personal transformation, personal understanding about myself and my relationship with life and what's going on around me, and hanging out with other people that thought that way too. That were, because there was a lot of folks wanting answers back then, because the war affected a lot of people, and families, and it wrecked families because some kids would knew right away it was wrong, and their families said, you got to go in the military, and they said, no way, I'm never joining the military. Well, then you got to leave home. It was awful. But people that were in the groups that I hung out with, they were using psychedelics to help them open up their hearts and their minds and learn something new about life that they'd never experienced before. And guys and gals. And so I met the woman who became my wife at the class, and we continued this experiment together. And eventually, uh, this guy who was teaching the class became popular all around the country, and people asked him to come to their place and talk to their kids and their people. So we all packed it up and bought old school buses and did this tour around the whole United States during the winter of 1970 that we called the Caravan. And we stopped at every place that he had a speaking engagement and talked with the people that came to see him talk and wanted to find out who we were and why we were involved with him. And so we did that for about 6 months and got back to San Francisco and decided that we needed to try and create a community on the land somewhere. And it didn't look like it was possible out in the Bay Area, so we decided to go back to one of the places where we had one of the nicest receptions in the whole country, which was in Tennessee, and came back and bought some land and started a place called the Farm Community, which still exists today. And it's just a few miles from where I live now. And my wife and I, we had 3 kids, and now I got 7 grandkids, and a couple of them are just a little older than you, the girls. So
Um,
there's a lot more to that than I can put in a short nutshell. But
right.
you can look up the farm community
Yeah.
online, and you can get a bit more of an understanding from what you can read in the websites about that.
So my next question will be my final question. And
Okay.
before I ask, I just want to thank you again. It's been really eye-opening to learn about this, especially as someone who is s- not so removed from the age you were when you were experiencing this. It's really moving to get to hear this, and I want to thank you for sharing it with me.
You're welcome.
Uh, my final question is, do you think my hope for this is that it can help educate younger Americans about war, about emotions, and about what happened.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, do you think there are any lessons, if there are any, that we can draw from your experiences, the experiences of other veterans, and the experience of Vietnam as a whole for, I guess, modern America, younger Americans in general?
Uh-huh. Well, you know, it's commonly taught to us that if you want to serve your country, you join the military. Well, that's not true. Um, for about 9 years, um, I belonged to an organization in Austin called um, um, Non-Military Options for Youth, and and it's part of a movement around the country that's called counter recruitment, and it's to help teach young people that if you really want to serve your country, there's lots of ways to do it. The military is not one of those ways to do it. The military, you serve the colonial interests, the imperialistic interest of the country that puts the uniform on you and sends you off to fight its battles. It's not about making things better. It's not about making democracy. It's not about getting the bad guy.
Right.
It's about creating opportunities for the corporate elite to have more access to materials. Vietnam is a rich country, has a lot of natural resources. That's what it was about. Not about ending the communists. It was taking over their stuff. And so I like to tell young folks to look look for what you would want to do to serve your country. Do you want to become a doctor, a nurse, a plumber, a teacher, an electrician, carpenter, an AC guy? Things that help people to live better.
Right.
That's where you're serving your country. That's the real thing. To become a baker, you know, to help people with it that need help with understanding the government system so they can get what they need. Become a politician, perhaps, and stop feeding the military because it does not need you. It wants you. Become part of their thing. So when people say, thank you for your service to me, I say, well, thank you for being nice to me, but I don't accept thank you for my service because it wasn't service, it was servitude. And so I don't put them off, but I let them know the truth about what they're saying. It really
Well,
is,
thank you.
it really wrecks
Sorry.
your soul to kill people. It really wrecks your soul. I've known people that have killed a bunch of people, and they all are still suffering, even though they might be living and doing things. But having that in their hearts and souls is an unmentionable burden. So, okay. Thank you for being there.
Thank you so much. It was really, I'm really glad I had this conversation. I'm really glad I was able to learn about this. And I'm also really glad for the other people who are going to watch this and are going to learn about this too. Thank you. Really, thank you so much.
You're very welcome. Keep in touch. Let me know how things go.
I will. Thank you.
All right.